In 1942, American pilots called it a flying coffin. The F4F Wildcat, outclimbed, outmaneuvered, and outgunned by Japan's legendary Zero, seemed destined for defeat in the Pacific. Yet behind enemy lines, Japanese pilots whispered a different story. What shocking truth did Imperial Japan discover about this underdog fighter that American pilots never realized? From desperate dogfights over Guadalcanal to classified intelligence reports in Tokyo, this is the untold story of how perception became America's greatest weapon in the Pacific Air War. Historical context. As war clouds gathered over the Pacific in 1941, America's naval aviation stood at a dangerous crossroads. The Grumman F4F Wildcat had only recently replaced the outdated F3F biplane as the Navy's primary carrier fighter. With its stubby fuselage, narrow landing gear, and modest speed, it hardly seemed the weapon to challenge Japan's air dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the previous decade perfecting naval aviation. Their A6M0 fighter represented the pinnacle of this effort, a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering that sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for exceptional range and maneuverability. On paper, the Zero outclassed the Wildcat in nearly every performance metric that mattered in a dogfight. When Pearl Harbor thrust America into war, the Navy had no alternative but to send Wildcat pilots against what was widely considered the most lethal fighter aircraft in the world. The stage was set for what many expected to be a one-sided slaughter in the skies over the Pacific. The pressure on Grumman and the American pilots was immense. The entire Pacific strategy hinged on whether carrier-based fighters could establish air superiority against Japan's seemingly unstoppable Zero. If the Wildcat failed, America's vulnerable aircraft carriers, the only offensive weapon remaining after Pearl Harbor, would be defenseless against Japan's experienced naval aviators. If you're fascinated by the hidden chapters of aviation history that shaped the outcome of World War II, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the real stories behind the warplanes that time almost forgot. Technical specifications. The Grumman F4F Wildcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was America's first line of defense wrapped in aluminum and steel. This carrier-based fighter featured a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp radial engine, giving it a top speed of 318 miles per hour, significantly slower than the Zero's 331 miles per hour. With a wingspan of 38 feet and length of just under 29 feet, the Wildcat was compact enough for carrier operations, but paid for this with limited maneuverability. When the Wildcat roared to life on a carrier deck, its distinctive sound, a throaty, aggressive growl from its radial engine, became a calling card that experienced Japanese pilots learned to recognize and respect. Unlike the Zero's smooth, high-pitched whine, the Wildcat announced its presence with a primal mechanical snarl that matched its stubborn fighting spirit. The physical dimensions revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Weighing 7,952 pounds fully loaded, compared to the Zero's featherweight 5,313 pounds, the Wildcat sacrificed agility for durability. Its armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, absent in early Zero models, meant it could absorb punishment that would send a Zero spiraling to the ocean in flames. The Wildcat's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns delivered devastating firepower, outgunning the Zero's 220mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns in terms of sustained fire. Grumman's engineering philosophy was evident in every aspect of the Wildcat's design. While Japanese engineers pursued elegant aerodynamic perfection, Grumman, nicknamed the Iron Works, built fighters that could take a beating and still bring their pilots home. This fundamental difference would prove more significant than any performance statistic on paper. The Wildcat's most distinctive feature, Its narrow, inward retracting landing gear, operated by a hand crank requiring 29 turns to deploy, was both a liability and, surprisingly, a tactical advantage. Japanese intelligence initially misinterpreted this unusual system as a design flaw rather than a weight-saving measure, leading to a critical underestimation of the aircraft's combat potential. Development drama. The F4F's development path was fraught with controversy and near cancellation. Originally designed as a biplane, the F4F1, before being reconfigured as a monoplane, F4F2, the Wildcat almost never made it to production. Naval brass, skeptical of the transition to monoplane fighters, nearly terminated the program in 1938 after early prototypes showed alarming spin characteristics that claimed the life of a test pilot. Development was particularly troubled by weight issues. As armor, self-sealing tanks, and additional weapons were added, the Wildcat's performance suffered. Engineers struggled to balance combat survivability with the agility needed to dogfight. Some Navy officials argued for abandoning the design entirely in favor of waiting for the more advanced F4F Hellcat, still years away from deployment. The engineering complexity was compounded by the need to create variants for different services. The Wildcat had to serve not only the Navy, but also the Royal Navy through the Lend-Lease program, where it was known as the Martlet. Each iteration required modifications that strained Grumman's production capacity as war approached. By early 1941, with conflict in the Pacific appearing inevitable, the pressure became intense. Military officials demanded improvements to match the Zero's capabilities, but Grumman engineers knew they couldn't transform the Wildcat into something it wasn't. Instead, they focused on maximizing its strengths, durability, firepower, and simplicity, while developing tactics to minimize its weaknesses. The turning point came when Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, analyzing intelligence reports on the Zero's performance, developed the Thatch Weave, a defensive tactic that transformed the Wildcat from underdog to deadly predator. This innovation, born of necessity rather than engineering, would prove more valuable than any technical modification. What Japanese intelligence missed in their assessment was how quickly American pilots would adapt. While Tokyo's analysts focused on performance metrics, they failed to account for the American talent for tactical innovation, a miscalculation that would cost them dearly in the battles to come. Enjoying this deep dive into the psychological battle behind the Pacific Air War? Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of the forgotten tactics that changed history. Combat performance. When Wildcats first engaged Zeros over the Philippines and Java in early 1942, the results seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. American pilots, still using outdated tactics designed for slower biplanes, suffered heavy losses. Reports reached Tokyo describing the Wildcat as cumbersome, predictable, and easily outmaneuvered. Japanese pilots, many with combat experience from China, initially viewed the engagement as shooting practice. But at Coral Sea and Midway, something changed. Japanese after-action reports noted with alarm that Wildcats were suddenly becoming more difficult to shoot down. Pilots reported that the Americans were refusing to dogfight, instead using hit-and-run tactics that negated the Zero's turning advantage. Most concerning to Japanese commanders was the discovery that Wildcats could absorb tremendous punishment and still return to their carriers. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's second-highest scoring ace, wrote in his combat journal, "The stubby American fighter lacks grace, but not courage. I put 20 rounds into one today, certain of victory, only to have it turn suddenly and charge directly at me, guns blazing. This is not the behavior of an inferior aircraft, but of one with hidden strengths we have not yet fully understood." The operational capabilities of the Wildcat revealed themselves most clearly at Guadalcanal, where Marine pilots of VMF-223 and VMF-224 flying from Henderson Field achieved an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, including Zeros. Operating from a primitive airstrip without proper maintenance facilities, the Wildcats demonstrated a ruggedness that the delicate Zero couldn't match in austere conditions. But behind the emerging success lay a psychological battle that has remained largely unexplored. Captured Japanese intelligence documents, only declassified in the 1980s, reveal that by late 1942, Imperial Navy analysts had begun warning commanders about a concerning shift in combat effectiveness of Wildcat units. They noted that while the aircraft itself hadn't changed, American tactics had evolved with alarming speed. Most shocking was the discovery that Japanese pilots began experiencing what psychologists now recognize as anticipatory anxiety when facing Wildcats. Despite flying the superior aircraft, the psychological burden of knowing that their Zero couldn't survive even a brief burst from the Wildcat's 6.50 caliber guns created hesitation at critical moments. As one Japanese veteran later confessed, "We began to fear not the Wildcat itself, but what it might do if we made even the smallest mistake." The statistics tell a revealing story carefully concealed from wartime propaganda on both sides. While early engagements in 1942 favored Japanese pilots, by mid-1943, the average Wildcat pilot was claiming 4.5 victories for every Wildcat lost, despite no significant changes to the aircraft itself. This transformation occurred before the introduction of the F4F Hellcat, suggesting that the Wildcat's reputation as merely a stopgap fighter deserves serious reconsideration. The Japanese assessment. Newly translated documents from Japan's Naval Air Technical Arsenal reveal a fascinating evolution in how Imperial Japan viewed the Wildcat. Initial reports dismissed it as Nikaiju, second-rate, but by mid-1942, internal assessments had upgraded it to Keikai Subeki, worthy of caution. What changed? The answer lies in a psychological miscalculation that plagued Japanese military thinking throughout the war. Imperial strategists, steeped in the concept of Yamato Damashi, Japanese spirit, believed that superior morale and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They projected this same thinking onto their enemies, expecting American pilots to attempt to dogfight Zeros despite their aircraft's limitations. When Americans instead adapted with tactics that maximized the Wildcat's strengths, Japanese commanders initially misinterpreted this as cowardice. A captured Japanese naval directive from October 1942 instructed pilots to shame the Americans into turning combat by aggressive pressing of attacks. This fundamental misunderstanding of American pragmatism proved costly. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Okumiya, a Zero Squadron leader at Rabaul, wrote in a confidential assessment, "The Americans have no concept of honor in aerial combat. They refuse to meet us on equal terms, using their superior numbers and firepower to ambush our formations. Most troubling is their willingness to break off and run when disadvantaged, only to return moments later from an unexpected direction." What Okumiya failed to recognize was that this wasn't cowardice, but calculated strategy. American pilots, under the guidance of tactical innovators like Thatch, Flatley, and Bauer, had developed a system that neutralized the Zero's advantages while maximizing the Wildcat's durability and firepower. Perhaps most revealing was a psychological profile of the Wildcat prepared for Japanese naval aviators in early 1943. The document, intended to boost morale, inadvertently revealed growing respect for the American fighter. The Wildcat pilot lacks the refinement and spirit of Imperial aviators but compensates with mechanical reliability and brutal directness. Do not mistake their pragmatic approach for weakness. They will sacrifice beauty for victory without hesitation. By 1943, Japanese technical experts had identified the Wildcat's true strength, not in its performance specifications, but in how it was used. A technical bulletin warned, "The Wildcat's greatest weapon is not its construction, but its tactics." American pilots have abandoned individual combat in favor of coordinated team attacks that negate our maneuverability advantage. Legacy and impact. The Wildcat's true legacy wasn't in its performance statistics, but in how it changed aerial combat psychology. While historians have traditionally viewed it as merely a stepping stone to better fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair, this interpretation misses its profound impact on Japanese combat morale. By mid-1943, the psychological advantage had shifted dramatically. Japanese pilots, once confident in their Zero's superiority, now approached combat with the Wildcat with growing apprehension. They knew that a single mistake, flying too long in a straight line, failing to spot a section of Wildcats setting up a thatch weave, or pressing an attack too aggressively, could be fatal. This psychological transformation is captured in a telling statistic. By the time the Wildcat was largely replaced by the Hellcat in late 1943, the average experience level of Japanese naval aviators had dropped from 700 pre-war flight hours to less than 200. The Wildcat had not only survived its trial by fire, but had contributed significantly to the decimation of Japan's irreplaceable veteran pilot corps. The lessons learned from the Wildcat Zero engagement influenced American fighter design for decades. Navy specifications began emphasizing durability, firepower, and pilot protection over maximum performance, a philosophy that continues to this day in aircraft like the F/A-18 Super Hornet. The concept that a fighter doesn't need to outperform its adversary in every metric to be effective became a cornerstone of American tactical thinking. For Japan, the failure to correctly assess the Wildcat represented a microcosm of larger intelligence failures. By focusing on technical specifications rather than tactical adaptation, Japanese planners missed the American talent for turning disadvantages into advantages through innovation and pragmatism. Today, only a handful of airworthy F4F Wildcats remain, mostly in museums or flying in air shows. When one of these rare fighters takes to the sky, its distinctive rumble carries echoes of a time when perception became a weapon as powerful as any cannon or machine gun. Aviation enthusiasts may admire the Zero's elegant lines and remarkable performance, but military historians understand that the stubby, ungainly Wildcat represents something perhaps more important: the triumph of adaptation over perfection. The shocking truth about what Japan thought of the F4F Wildcat isn't that they underestimated it, though initially they did, but that they failed to understand how quickly Americans would transform their assessment from accurate to obsolete. While Japanese pilots continued to rely on the inherent capabilities of their aircraft, American pilots changed the rules of engagement entirely. In the final analysis, the Wildcat's greatest contribution wasn't in the aircraft it shot down, but in the combat philosophy it fostered. It taught American pilots that victory doesn't always go to the better aircraft, but often to the better strategy. A lesson that would serve the United States well, not just in World War II, but in conflicts for generations to come. If you appreciate these deep dives into the psychological dimensions of aerial warfare, be sure to subscribe for more stories that explore how perception and reality collided in the skies over the Pacific. What legendary aircraft matchup should we explore next? The Hellcat versus the George? The Corsair against the Frank? Let us know in the comments below.